Welcome again to Religion 212. This is week number 4. This week we're going to be discussing chapters 5 and 6 in your text, dealing with the books of Luke and John, the last two Gospels in the New Testament. This is going to be broken into two different videos. This first video dealing with the book of Luke. So again, this week we're going to talk about some basic questions. First of all, who wrote the gospel? Where was it written? What sources were used? When was it dated? Who is its target audience? And what did the book of Luke contribute? Throughout your reading, you'll really get into some of these questions a little bit more, and you'll be able to see these showing up in your outlines. But getting into these questions, who wrote the gospel? Well, even though all four gospels are really unattributed, or when I say they're unattributed, I mean the author didn't really specify who they were, but it was later added that this was the gospel according to Luke. There is pretty strong evidence that it actually was Luke that wrote this particular book, and you'll see some of that in your reading. Where was it written? Well, this is unknown, but if you look at where Luke was from and where he was during the time period, it's very likely that it was in Rome. Highly unlikely it was anywhere else outside of Rome, especially with some of the stories that were told and how they were told. What sources were used? Again, like Matthew, a lot of the sources that were used was probably Mark and some of that Q source where we found a lot of stories and things that were kind of written, narrative accounts of Christ and his ministry that were written down, and those were stories probably taken from that Q source. When was this book dated? Well, it was probably either in the late 60s or in a time period between 75 through 85 AD are kind of the most popular answers. Kind of hard to pinpoint some of these things because they're not really actually spelled out in the book themselves. But, given that Christ, died in the lower 30s of AD, well, you can imagine that these were just a handful of years after Christ's death, and so we're not talking about hundreds of years later. They were still popular firsthand accounts of what had actually happened for some of these things to get relayed. Who was the target audience? Really, if you look at Luke and some of the things, there are a little bit of debate to the author, what he was trying to accomplish, but most people will tell you that it was really written to the Gentiles. In fact, you actually see several words that at the time period, a lot of early believers were converts from Judaism to Christianity. Um, and when you look at Luke's language, he used lots of words that normally would have a Jewish background, but he would use words that most Gentiles would recognize in some of his descriptions. And so it's kindly thought that he was more of trying to reach the Gentile population with this message. And of course, you'll see that later when you see that the author of the book of Luke also wrote the book of Acts, and you'll see some of the same things in the book of Acts or whatever. And what did this contribute? Really, the book of Luke really shows the importance of God's plan. It also has many vantage points of showing Christ dealing with outcasts, poor, and sinners. So a lot of times, and that really turned the world upside down at that time period because you know the Judaizers, when they were witnessing Christ preaching to the poor, preaching to the sick, the sinners, those were not thought to be very high people, obviously, in that time period. And the Judaizers, or the preachers of the law, the chief of priests, they didn't want to touch or deal with those types of people because they were a different class. So Jesus kind of turned the whole class system upside down because he showed this, the least of these, that is sometimes the most important. Some different emphasis you want to look at. Luke is the longest book in the New Testament. Well, as I already said, he also wrote the book of Acts. It's written to Theophilus, which is translated in the Greek to the lover of God. Really, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'll pick this back up in the next video and talk about this just a little bit more while I'm also talking about John. So make sure you watch that other video.